In the previous video about Montano, you discovered the extraordinary story of the young shaman from the Falcon tribe who became one of the most honorable vampires in history. But there's a much deeper layer to this narrative that we need to explore today. What we witnessed wasn't just the encounter between a mortal and a vampire. It was a frontal collision between two completely opposite spiritual universes. On one side, African shamanism, one of humanity's oldest traditions. On the other, medieval European Christianity, young but aggressively at the center of this collision, a 6-year-old boy holding the skull of his murdered master. This is the story of a conflict that lasted centuries, a conflict that explains why Europe waged relentless war against any spirituality outside the Church's control, a conflict that still echoes today, shaping how we understand the sacred and profane. To truly comprehend Montano's sacrifice, to understand the weight of his eternal oath to La Sombra, we need to dive into this spiritual abyss, an abyss carved by centuries of intolerance, blood, and power. Because Montano's story isn't just about vampires. It's about what happens when entire spiritual systems collide, and how that collision shaped the destiny of continents. Today, we'll explore 3 dimensions of this conflict. First, the complete historical context of the spiritual and political forces at play. Second, the shamanic system that Ontai knew, its practices and millennial wisdom. Third, the brutal shock when that world met medieval Christian Europe. And at the end, we'll connect this to the legacy that persists to our present day. Prepare yourselves. This journey crosses continents, centuries, and the depths of the human soul. To understand the spiritual conflict that defined Montano's life, we need to go back to the 12th century and examine 2 worlds on a collision course: shamanic East Africa and medieval Christian Europe. The East Africa where Ontai was born was a mosaic of spiritual traditions that had existed for thousands of years. The tribes of Mount Kilimanjaro practiced shamanism transmitted through generations since time immemorial. These weren't primitive practices, as Europeans would later label them. They were sophisticated spiritual systems deeply integrated into daily life. The African shaman wasn't simply a healer. He was a mediator between worlds, counselor, doctor, psychologist, diplomat, and guardian of collective memory. The shaman knew medicinal plants, interpreted nature's signs, communicated with ancestors, and negotiated with spirits. He was the living bridge between the community and the cosmos. When Ontai's master was murdered by La Sombra, it wasn't just a man who died. A living library of knowledge died. Each shaman carried centuries of wisdom about medicine, astronomy, psychology, and philosophy. A shaman's death was like burning an entire library. La Sombra chose the Falcon tribe for specific reasons. Mount Kilimanjaro wasn't just an imposing mountain. It was a spiritual center of continental importance. The tribes on its slopes were known for warrior strength and unbreakable spiritual resistance. They were never conquered peoples with pure traditions, producing warriors of legendary courage. For an ancient vampire who had destroyed entire civilizations, finding truly incorruptible warriors was a rare discovery. La Sombra didn't just want to create a powerful servant. He wanted to break the unbreakable. He wanted to prove that even the deepest spiritual tradition could be subverted and transformed to serve his purposes. Meanwhile, in Europe, a completely different drama was unfolding. Christianity, which had begun as a persecuted sect, had become the official religion of the world's most powerful empire. The Catholic Church not only survived Rome's fall, but prospered on its ruins, becoming the only pan-European institution capable of unifying the fragmented medieval kingdoms. In the 12th century, when Ontai was born, Christian Europe was at the height of its aggressiveness. The Crusades were sending tens of thousands of warriors to conquer Jerusalem. But the Crusades were more than military expeditions. They were manifestations of an ideology that divided the world into two categories: Christians and infidels. All infidels were enemies to be converted or destroyed. Within Europe itself, the Church waged an equally relentless war against heresy and paganism. European spiritual traditions, many with shamanic roots similar to African practices, were being systematically eradicated. Healers who used herbs were accused of witchcraft. Seers were denounced as servants of the devil. Guardians of ancient traditions were burned at the Inquisition's stakes, which was already taking form. The medieval church wasn't just promoting a faith. It was establishing an absolute monopoly on access to the divine. The message was clear. There is only one path to God, and it passes exclusively through the Catholic Church. Any other method of spiritual connection was automatically demonic and worthy of destruction. When La Sombra transformed Ontai into Montano and took him to Europe, he didn't just change his geographic location. He transplanted someone raised in a tradition of pluralistic acceptance and direct connection with the divine to a continent dominated by absolute intolerance and rigid spiritual hierarchy. Montano arrived in Rome carrying his murdered master's skull. Imagine the brutal symbolism. A vampirized Africa, raised in the world's oldest shamanic tradition, walking through the streets of the city that had become the center of a religion that declared all other traditions works of the devil. He literally carried the mortal remains of a spiritual world that Europe was determined to erase. The Rome that Montano found was a city of violent contradictions. On one hand, Christianity's spiritual center, home of the Pope. On the other hand, a den of political intrigue, murders, rampant clerical corruption, and practices that mocked all Christian teachings about humility. The vampire clans had deeply infiltrated all church power structures. Ventru occupied ecclesiastical positions. La Sombra manipulated bishops. Toreador financed magnificent cathedrals. The very institution that preached war against demons was completely infested with vampires using spiritual authority as a weapon of control. This was the brutal context where Montano would have to survive. Two titanic spiritual forces, each claiming absolute truth, each willing to destroy any alternative, and in the middle, a young shaman transformed into a vampire, carrying millennial wisdom in a world that would burn alive anyone who practiced it. To understand what Ontai lost when he became Montano, we need to dive into the African shamanic system. Not as exotic curiosity, but as a sophisticated spiritual technology that worked effectively for millennia. The African shamanism of the Kilimanjaro tribes wasn't a religion in the European sense. It had no written dogmas, centralized clerical hierarchy, or concept of heresy. It was fundamentally spiritual technology, a set of practices tested by generations to navigate the visible and invisible dimensions of reality. Shamanic training began in childhood, often after a traumatic event that opened the child's perception to realities beyond the physical world. Ontai, born during a storm that killed his mother, was identified from birth as carrying a special connection with the spirit world. His survival when everyone expected his death was interpreted as a sign that the spirits had plans for him. The shaman who adopted him didn't teach through books or sermons. He taught through direct experience. Ontai learned to enter altered states of consciousness through breathing techniques, fasting, ecstatic dance, careful use of sacred plants, and long periods of isolation in nature. These weren't superstitious practices. They were precise methods of altering brain chemistry and expanding perception beyond the limits of normal consciousness. During these altered states, the apprentice learned to travel through what Africans called the spirit world. It wasn't a metaphorical place. For them, it was as real as the physical world, only accessible through different states of consciousness. In this spirit world, the shaman could communicate with dead ancestors, negotiate with nature's spirits, diagnose diseases by seeing their spiritual causes directly, and seek guidance for his community. A crucial aspect of African shamanism was its understanding of disease. For the shaman, every disease had both a physical and spiritual dimension. A fever, for example, wasn't just an infection in the body. It was also an imbalance in the person's relationship with spirits, a violation of taboos, or a manifestation of unresolved conflicts. Healing meant treating both dimensions simultaneously. The healing methods were extraordinarily sophisticated. The shaman used medicinal plants with encyclopedic botanical knowledge. He knew hundreds of plants, their chemical properties, interactions, and appropriate dosages. Modern research has confirmed that many of these plants contain powerful medicinal compounds that Western science only rediscovered centuries later. But this shaman wasn't limited to physical treatment. He performed what we'd call deep psychotherapy today. Through elaborate rituals, chants, dances, and dramatizations, he helped the sick person confront traumas, resolve internal conflicts, and reintegrate fragmented aspects of their psyche. The shamanic healing ritual was therapeutic theater where patient, community, and spirit world gathered to restore balance. Ontai's master taught him to read nature's signs with remarkable precision. He learned to predict climate changes by observing animal and plant behavior. He learned to find water in arid lands, following signs invisible to untrained eyes. He learned to identify poisons and antidotes, prepare remedies for dozens of diseases, and recognize signs of spiritual imbalance before they manifested as physical illness. A crucial aspect of training was developing a deep personal relationship with what shamans called guide spirits, or power animals. Ontai, through visions induced in his shamanic journeys, discovered that his power animal was the falcon, the same animal that gave his tribe its name. This wasn't an abstract symbol. For Ontai, the falcon spirit was a real presence, an ally that could be invoked in times of need, offering protection, guidance, and power. The relationship with animal spirits taught deep lessons about one's own nature. By identifying with the falcon, Ontai learned about sharp vision, patience, precise timing, and the ability to see the complete panorama from great heights while maintaining focus on minuscule details. These were qualities consciously cultivated through specific shamanic practices. Complete shamanic initiation was a process of symbolic death and rebirth. Ontai went through extreme ordeals that took him to the boundaries of sanity and survival. He was sent alone into the forest for weeks, without food, having to survive with only his knowledge and spiritual guidance. He was symbolically buried and had to be reborn. He faced his deepest fears and visions induced by sacred plants. These ordeals weren't cruelty. They were time-tested methods to destroy the ordinary ego and rebuild the shaman's personality on solid foundations. A shaman who hadn't died and been reborn, who hadn't visited the depths of terror and madness and returned sane, couldn't be trusted to guide others through similar crises. The shaman's own journey through suffering qualified him to be a guide for others who suffer. The skull that Ontai carried after his master was murdered wasn't just a memorial. In African shamanism, skulls of dead shamans were sacred objects of immense power. They were believed to contain part of the deceased's essence and wisdom. Carrying his master's skull meant that Ontai literally carried ancestral knowledge, that he was the guardian of centuries of shamanic wisdom that shouldn't be lost. Shamanism also had a crucial social dimension. The shaman wasn't an authority figure who commanded blind obedience. He was a servant of the community. His power came from his demonstrated ability to heal, prophesy, mediate conflicts, and maintain harmony between visible and invisible worlds. If a shaman consistently failed, he lost his position. There was no unquestionable dogma, only practical results. At 6 years old, when La Sambra arrived, Ontai was already an advanced practitioner, capable of entering shamanic trance, communicating with animal spirits, diagnosing diseases through spiritual vision, and preparing dozens of herbal remedies. His training was incomplete, but he already carried more spiritual and medicinal knowledge than most Christian priests would ever learn. Ontai's transformation into Montano was a spiritual cataclysm of cosmic proportions, a brutal confrontation between two completely incompatible universes of meaning fought on the battlefield of a young man's soul. When La Sambra drained Ontai's blood and replaced it with vampiric vita, he wasn't just creating another servant. He was attempting an impossible experiment, maintaining the warrior essence, an unbreakable honor of African shamanism, while transplanting it to the radically different context of European vampiric society. It was like cultivating a tropical plant in glaciers and expecting it to flourish. The first shock was the thirst. Not ordinary thirst, but vampiric thirst. A craving that consumes every fiber of being, transforms the entire person into a single need, blood. For a shaman trained in extreme mental discipline, in control over states of consciousness, the experience of vampiric thirst was a fundamental violation of everything he was. In African shamanism, eating human flesh or drinking human blood were the deepest absolute taboos. Acts that placed a person beyond humanity transformed them into something monstrous. Cases of cannibalism were universally associated with malignant witchcraft of the blackest type, practices that every true shaman fought against. Now Montano found himself not only practicing this supreme taboo, but being physically incapable of surviving without practicing it. His very existence as a vampire placed him in the category of what, as a shaman, he had sworn to destroy. The contradiction was psychologically devastating. How could he maintain any sense of identity or integrity when his own survival required him to continually violate the most sacred taboos of his culture? La Sambra, with characteristic cruelty, offered no consolation. On the contrary, he deliberately maximized the trauma by forcing Montano to kill and feed on members of his own Falcon tribe, starting with his closest friends. It wasn't enough to make Montano a vampire. La Sambra wanted to completely destroy any possibility that Montano might maintain emotional or spiritual ties with his past. But here, La Sambra made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed that the loyalty he sought would only come through complete destruction of Ontai's previous identity. What he didn't understand was that the shamanic warrior honor that made Ontai attracted was inseparable from the spiritual cosmology he was trying to destroy. When Montano swore eternal loyalty to La Sambra, he didn't do it because his shamanic identity had been destroyed. He did it because his shamanic identity remained intact, but was radically reinterpreted within a new reality. Montano applied shamanism's own logic of accepting transformation and rebirth, of navigating between worlds, of maintaining integrity even in extreme circumstances, to his vampiric situation. In shamanism, as we've discussed, initiation involves symbolic death and rebirth. Montano simply extended this concept to its literal extreme. He had died as Ontai the mortal shaman. He had been reborn as Montano, the immortal vampire. This was the most extreme type of shamanic initiation imaginable, taking the analogy to literal territory that no mortal shaman had ever experienced. Montano's decision to save his tribe by offering himself to La Sombra was perfectly consistent with shamanic ethics. The shaman was the tribe's protector, willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good. Ontai had seen his master brutally murdered by La Sombra. He knew the vampire was incredibly powerful, that conventional resistance would be futile, that his entire tribe would be massacred if he didn't find another solution. He did what a shaman would do, used cunning instead of brute force. He offered La Sombra exactly what the vampire wanted, but on terms that preserved a core of personal integrity. He offered voluntary loyalty, not coerced obedience. This was a subtle but crucial distinction that La Sombra, in his arrogance, failed to perceive until it was too late. Montano's journey from Africa to Europe was a spiritual odyssey as brutal as any physical voyage. He carried his master's skull not just as a memorial but as a spiritual anchor, a constant reminder of who he had been and what he had sworn to protect. That skull represented millennia of shamanic wisdom, and as long as Montano carried it, that wisdom wasn't completely lost. Upon arriving in Europe, Montano found himself on a continent where everything he considered sacred was demonized. His shamanic practices of entering trance would be called demonic possession. His knowledge of medicinal plants would be labeled witchcraft. His ability to navigate altered states would be interpreted as trafficking with the devil. Even his skin color marked him as a son of Ham, cursed according to medieval Christian theology. But Montano quickly perceived something that Christian Europeans couldn't see: the massive hypocrisy at the heart of medieval Christianity. The church preached humility but accumulated obscene wealth, preached charity but tortured the poor, preached love but burned dissenters, preached equality but maintained rigid hierarchies, preached about demons while real vampires literally controlled bishops and popes. From Montano's shamanic point of view, what he saw in Christian Europe was a profoundly spiritually sick culture, a culture that had cut its own shamanic roots, lost contact with nature and the spirit world, placed intermediaries between people and the divine, and transformed spiritual seeking into a system of social control. The supreme irony: Montano, the African vampire trained in pagan shamanism, maintained more genuine spiritual integrity than most Christian prelates who preached against demons. He never pretended to be what he wasn't, never preached virtues he didn't practice, never used spirituality as a manipulation tool. His loyalty to La Sombra, though born of terrible circumstances, was genuine, based on personal honor, not fear or coercion. Throughout the centuries, while serving La Sombra in Europe, Montano witnessed the systematic destruction of everything shamanism represented. He saw the Inquisition burn tens of thousands. He saw entire bodies of knowledge about herbal medicine, psychology, and contemplative practices be lost. He saw entire peoples have their spiritual identities ripped out and forcibly replaced. And through it all, Montano carried his master's skull. He carried it not as a dead relic, but as a living symbol of resistance. Each night that passed, each century he survived, was a victory against La Sombra's attempt to completely destroy the shamanic identity that made him who he was. When Graciano betrayed La Sombra and anarchs destroyed the clan founder, Montano could have rejoiced, could have seen it as liberation. the end of centuries of servitude. But he didn't, because his loyalty was never about blood bond or coercion. It was about personal honor, about a given word, about integrity maintained against impossibilities. This is the deepest lesson of the shamanism versus Christianity conflict that Montano posed. True spirituality cannot be destroyed by external force. It can be suppressed, it can be hidden, it can be forced to adapt, but the essential core remains. Montano proved this by living it for millennia. The spiritual conflict that Montano personified didn't end in the Middle Ages. It echoes through the centuries to our present day, manifesting in ways we might not immediately recognize. The systematic destruction of shamanic traditions in medieval Europe established a pattern that would be repeated around the world. When European explorers reached the Americas, they encountered societies with rich and complex shamanic traditions. The response was identical: destruction, demonization, forced conversion. Native American shamans were killed, their practices prohibited, their sacred plants criminalized. In Africa, European colonizers waged a similar war against local spiritual traditions. Shamans were denounced as witch doctors. Ancestral rituals were forbidden. Children were forcibly removed from families to be educated in Christian missions, where any manifestation of traditional spirituality was brutally punished. The pattern repeated in Australia with Aboriginals, in Asia with indigenous peoples, in literally every corner of the world where European Christianity encountered other spiritual traditions. Always the same strategy: monopolize access to the divine, eliminate alternatives, establish a hierarchy of mandatory intermediaries. But something interesting happened in the 20th century. As science began studying altered states of consciousness, it discovered that shamans were right about many things. Studies on deep meditation confirmed that humans can access radically different states of consciousness. Research on psychedelic plants revealed that compounds used in shamanic rituals have profound therapeutic effects for trauma, depression, and anxiety. Anthropologists who actually studied shamanism instead of just condemning it discovered sophisticated systems of psychology, ecology, and medicine. They discovered that what Europeans labeled as primitive superstition was often empirical knowledge accumulated through millennia of careful experimentation. Today, we see a global resurgence of interest in shamanic practices. People disillusioned with institutional religion seek direct spiritual connection. Therapists integrate techniques derived from shamanic practices. Scientists study medicinal plants used by shamans for thousands of years. It's as if the knowledge they tried to destroy is rising from the ashes. Montano, if he still exists, must observe this with complex interest. Does it vindicate the shamanic tradition he carried through the centuries? Or is it superficial appropriation that loses the real essence? The question remains open. What isn't open to debate is the legacy of destruction. How much knowledge was lost forever in the Inquisition's fires? How many potential cures? How many psychological techniques? How much wisdom about living in harmony with nature disappeared when the last shaman of a lineage died without passing knowledge forward? Montano's story is a microcosm of this larger tragedy. A boy who should have become a great shaman, guardian of millennial wisdom for his tribe, was transformed into a vampire and dragged to a continent that considered everything he represented demonic. And yet, against all odds, he kept a core of shamanic integrity alive through millennia. If there's a lesson in his story, it's that genuine spirituality, true honor, and personal integrity cannot be destroyed by external force. They can be tested, they can be forced to adapt, but the essence remains. Montano proved this. And perhaps, more broadly, the modern resurgence of interest in shamanism proves that deep truths have a way of surviving, even through centuries of suppression. We return to where we began, young Ontai, on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, holding the skull of his murdered master, about to make an oath that would change not only his life, but preserve through millennia a spiritual tradition that Europe tried to destroy. Montano's story isn't just about vampires and supernatural powers. It's about the collision between spiritual worlds, about what we lost when we tried to monopolize access to the sacred, about the human cost of religious intolerance. The shamanism that Ontai practiced offered direct connection with the divine, personal responsibility, integration of body and spirit, harmony with nature. The medieval Christianity he encountered offered rigid hierarchy, mandatory intermediaries, separation between sacred and profane, domination over nature. Which system was really more civilized? History forces us to question assumptions, but history also shows us that truth has a way of surviving. The shamanic knowledge they tried to destroy is resurfacing. People recognize the value of ancient practices. Science validates what shamans always knew. The cycle continues. What other historical truths have been buried but deserve to be read? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this deep analysis fascinated you, subscribe to the channel. We have more historical mysteries that will challenge everything you think you know about the past. And if you want to dive even deeper into Montano and other vampires of the Inquisition, check out the complete playlist. Each story reveals a different layer of hidden truth about how spiritual power shapes the destiny of civilizations. The next video explores another crucial aspect: how the Order of the Dragon really functioned, and the secrets they tried to keep hidden about the war against vampires. Don't miss it. Until then, remember, history we don't question is history that controls us. Keep questioning. Keep seeking truth.